Welcome to the Alice Paul Center podcast series, bringing you the latest in gender, sexuality, and queer scholarship and practice. Hi, I'm really fortunate to be here with Jen Manion, Associate Professor of History at Amherst College and the author of Liberty's Prisoners, a study of incarceration in early Philadelphia. My name is Kathleen Brown. I'm the David Boyce Professor of History and the Director of the Alice Paul Center and Gender and Sexuality and Women's Studies program. Jen visited us at Penn this year and gave 2 filled-to-capacity talks for the Alice Paul Center, Transgender Ways of Thinking and Language, Acts, and Identity in LGBT Histories. So now we have a chance to talk to Jen a little bit more about their work and how queer theory has been an influence on their scholarship. So, Jen, I want to start by asking you, what is the influence of queer theory generally on your scholarship?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I love the opportunity to talk to you about these questions. I think queer theory has made me a much more skeptical and cautious historian, because so much of queer theory is about questioning our basic assumptions about dominant norms and categories. It's about exposing the functions of power and denaturalizing systems, relationships, identities, and binaries that are so often made to seem natural. Yep. So I think that, when I read things even that are accepted as historic truth, my first instinct is to ask, well, how do you really know that, right? Or why are you so sure? So in this respect, queer theory is like a tremendous tool for helping us read against the grain or read between the lines or question established truths.
Great. Jen, if you would, could you describe the path from the influences of queer theory and your historical work on sexuality in your first book to the historical work on trans people in your current project? In one of your talks, you described going back to gender. Could you help us understand what this means for you intellectually as someone informed by queer theory, trying to understand the lives of trans individuals in the past?
Sure, that's a great question. One of my aims as a historian has always been to uncover the queer past. And, so much of what we know from histories of sexuality in the early period come from court and legal records. But they're mostly about forms of heterosexual sex that needed policing and also same-sex intimacies among men. But lesbian histories, especially in the U.S. context and before the 20th century, were few and far between, right? So I could barely even find enough evidence for my first book to even say anything about attitudes toward or the policing of same-sex intimacies between women. And so even though the history of sexuality expanded its purview far beyond sex itself to questions of intimacies, friendship, and communities, we've always struggled to find women who fit this paradigm or to figure out what their story was. So that's why you have so much scholarship from the 1980s and 90s that tries to fit the people, they refer to them as passing women or cross-dressing. Now we would say they were people who were assigned female at birth who lived as men. They tried to smush them into a lesbian history timeline.
Right.
But part of what I think is so exciting, and this is what transgender studies has helped me see, is that if you put the question of sexuality or sex to the side, and instead you're looking at gender nonconformity, how it presents itself, how it's judged, then it's like a jackpot, right? It's everywhere. Mm. So this is like the way that I see gender in some ways as being a big part of the future for the history of sexuality of women.
Mm. Yes.
Aside from the fact that, yes, now we have this whole new way that we could talk about a trans past and transgender studies. But it's really transgender studies that have given me the ability to even see this in the archive and then the language to try to work with it.
Yes. Yeah, that's amazing. What is the influence of queer theory on your current scholarship?
the influence of queer theory in my current project, is tremendous. It's not even possible without it. And I think Judith Butler, Susan Stryker, and Jack Halberstam are the three people that come to mind immediately. And so there are ways that, lots of historians cite Butler's early work in gender trouble, in, her claims that, that gender is, her theory of performativity, right? That gender is not a manifestation or an expression of sex, but something that's constituted through the repetition of acts.
Yep.
That this is something that historians cite, but I don't actually think we've taken to its logical conclusion in a meaningful way to really denaturalize the categories of men and women, which people still write about as if they're unchanging and fixed groupings all the time. I mean, it's kind of like a bedrock. It's a foundation for historical writing. But this, that theory is so important in my work because it helps me show how the repetition of certain behaviors of trans people in the past actually helps to stabilize their trans identities. Yep. And the archive shows that in, illustrious ways again and again and again. And so partly I'm trying to bring light to an archive and a condition that was denied and erased for hundreds of years, right? Yep. And so that theory, along with Butler's notion of precarity, is also very useful because she helps us see why certain experiences remain illegible and outside of historic methods. And then we think about these precarious subjects. It helps us to see the tremendous vulnerability to violence and aggression that these people face, both by individuals and the state. And so that's like one tool, right? And that's early queer theory. Also, Jack Halberstam's work on female masculinity was so groundbreaking 20 years ago, and it was something that I long wanted to figure out how to engage with in a more sustained way. And I think, especially now, their work on the boundaries between butch lesbians and trans men opened up space for me, both personally and intellectually, to think both about how these categories constitute themselves, but then why they're so rigid for some people and porous for others. Mm. And so that's kind of a question that I also bring with me to the archive of similar subjects who might embody gender and sexual nonconformity in a range of ways, and trying to think about how to think about them in relation to each other, which feels much more recent, but has its roots in this work from 20 years ago. I think there are two different working definitions, I think, that I rely on a lot. And Susan Stryker puts one forward in her transgender history book from 2008, that we think about transgender not as an identitarian, category or really even a destination, but as a way to think about anyone who moves away from normative expectations of gender that are associated with your assigned sex. So it's this very broad, expansive, conceptual category, which I use a lot as I think about the 18th and 19th century. But then even in this early, another approach, which Susan Stryker and Paisley Carra and Lisa Jean Moore put forward in their early special issue in transgender studies of the Women's Studies Quarterly, talk about, well, what is gender, right? And again, as a historian, I'm so often just laden with these categories of man, woman, man, woman, man, woman. But they say gender, we think of genders as porous, impermeable spaces, right? That there's more than two. And that for some people, they're constantly changing. And so I just get this sense of these really dynamic, just like a dynamism, a sense of changing and a fluidity that then I can kind of have foreground in my mind as I read the archive in a different way.
And do you feel like when you're in the archive doing that, mean, a set of practices, or is it just a set of questions that you have to keep asking yourself as you're looking and as you're reading and interpreting?
So it's two things. So one is like a very basic question inspired by Butler, which is, how is gender constituted? How is it spoken of, right? Like in the archive. But then the other, I really do, it is a transgender way of thinking, which is what, we were talking about when I was on campus. And some of it is as much inspired by contemporary transgender community practice, which was also inspired by theory, but there are many ways that I think the scholarship in the field of transgender studies is catching up with how we are living our lives and the discursive tools that we've adopted to try to make more space for how we see each other and how we talk about each other in reference to gender.
Good. Well, that's a lot to think about. And so with some trepidation, I ask you one of the questions we've asked everybody on the podcast series, which is the question posed by the title of the series, What is Left of Queer Theory Now? How would you answer that question?
So I think it's a really exciting time in many ways because transgender studies is still just getting started as a field, even though some of the early texts are now 20 years old. Most of them are 10 years old. And so I can't wait to see the work that comes out in the next decade. And then it also seems like people who are trained in English and American studies and Africana studies and gender studies are embracing archival work again, which is exciting to me as a historian because I think there are tremendous opportunities for work at the intersection of theory and archives, especially in transgender studies.
Yep.
And then, as always, I hope that more historians, especially those who write about the 18th and 19th century, get more engaged with queer and trans theory, because I do think it can help us write more critical histories of the past, especially for people who are writing about difference and power.
Yep. Yes. Well, thank you for spending some time talking with us. We really enjoyed your visits to campus, and you reached lots of students and faculty. And hopefully with this conversation, we'll reach another audience interested in what's left of queer theory now. So again, thank you, Jen Manion. And I'll just, to listeners, remind them that if they want to listen to the full What's Left of Queer Theory Now podcast series, please go to the Alice Paul Center website at the University of Pennsylvania. And we'd also like to thank the Kelly Writers House for their technical support. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Alice Paul Center podcast series. To listen to other episodes, please go to the Alice Paul Center website at the University of Pennsylvania.